I had been read on to top secret, special compartment, intelligence, gamma, delta, all of these different levels of intelligence access. And this read on was more strict than anything I'd done before. Then Tom says, what we do is we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline known as remote viewing. Basically, we want to invite you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. So we didn't know what the target was, had no idea, didn't realize it had anything to do with ETs or whatever. Up to that point, we've been working standard training targets, which were all geographical locations or similar, right? Something was concrete we had feedback on. Skip would throw in these ringers every now and again. Sometimes it's something totally out of the ordinary, but he'd usually pick something that he felt like he had pretty good reason to think there would be some there, right? Yeah. And these bases were one of them. So he ran us on this. And what was interesting was I drew a sketch of what you would look at today and say that's a tic-tac.
Yeah.
Based off of the Nimitz encounter. Looked just like a tic-tac.
What if your mind could transcend the boundaries of space and time? What if with the right training it could penetrate mountains, cross oceans, even make contact with hidden intelligences? Well, Major Paul Smith is one of the few individuals ever to officially be trained really in all of the above. Paul was part of the fabled Project Stargate. He served in the Army's top secret remote viewing program at Fort Meade in Maryland, remote viewing everything from mundane training targets to actual points of intelligence interest, and yes, potentially at least, UFO bases as part of the infamous Project 8200. And if that sounds completely out there, delulu, beyond belief, believe me, I get it. But much more context to come in the episode itself. And by the way, if your wonder whiskers were perked up by the tale from a few weeks back of remote viewer Pat Price remote viewing the UFO bases, this is indeed an extension of that very same lore. But what makes all this so much more compelling for me isn't just what Paul and his colleagues saw, it's what it implies about reality and consciousness itself. Remote viewing points to an ontology where mind is non-local, where time and space can be transcended by consciousness. And my God, the esoteric implications and possibilities associated with that are just massive and potentially pretty schizo if we don't deal with them skillfully. And on that note, when it comes to topics like this, as interested in them as I am, I'm pretty selective about who I have in the mind meld to discuss them. And Dr. Paul Smith is really one of the best possible representatives, ambassadors on the planet for these ideas. Not only was he, like I said, part of Fort Meade's remote viewing contingent, he went on to earn a Ph.D. in philosophy at UT Austin, and he's never stopped training and teaching his remote viewing capacities. He's also the author of Reading the Enemy's Mind and the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. I also just find him incredibly believable and down to earth and overall brilliant. But before I gush forth further, all of the links that you will need for both Paul and Third Eye Drops are in the description. And before I forget, if you'd be so kind, do stimulate the algorithm with all the buttons. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. Do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got hundreds of audio-only episodes in our back catalog that I suspect you will enjoy. We've also got a growing catalog of YouTube members-only / Patreon content, so we would love it if you initiated yourself over at patreon.com / Third Eye Drops or clicked your way on over to the members-only tab and sign up. Also, before I forget, both Paul and myself will be at Contact in the Desert this year at the end of this month, end of May. Not a sponsor, but if you want to join us, you can get 10% off at the link in the description. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with Paul Smith. Paul, it is really, really an honor to have you on the show. I've been, digging into the history of a lot of what you were involved in, your stories in general. And like I mentioned before we started recording, I'm just so interested in the philosophy of consciousness, which I know is a central interest of yours too. So, man, an embarrassment of riches in this conversation.
I hope I don't embarrass you.
And that's another thing I love about you. You're incredibly humble, I think, too. And, with this topic, obviously, comes a certain amount of understandable skepticism from a segment of the population. And I think you're just such a great ambassador for this because you seem so down to earth and you have such like I I can tell another thing I love about you is that you sort of shrug off flattery well. Um, but really, truly, like you've got this really rich background that's just kind of soaked in credentials from both the army and from your education. So I think you're just an amazing ambassador for this conversation.
Well, I appreciate that. And I have to say, I am very proud of my humility. So,
It's like a paradox right there, or paradox off the bat. Um, But yeah, let's start with, the background. I know you've told these stories many times, but I feel like it's important for contextualization. But so this remote viewing program starts in the early 70s during the Cold War, far before the Army's direct involvement in your role, eventual role. But you want to give a little background on why this started and how the intelligence agencies got interested in remote viewing and why they thought this was an important avenue to pursue?
sure. So, the earliest real mention I've seen any research into this at the government or intelligence community level was in the 60s. It was part of the infamous MK Ultra project, which
Hmm.
was far more than just mind control. MK Ultra involved a number of different things. And they did some basically well, back then it was book and journal research into parapsychology with some thought to see if it might apply to the CIA mission. Um, but nothing went very far until the very late 60s, early 70s, when the CIA really started looking into what kind of an effort the Russians were doing, the Soviets. But,
Hmm.
Russians and Soviets are pretty isomorphic when you look at it,
Sure.
right? um, and they were spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars on what we would consider to be paranormal or fringe kind of research. And the CIA knew that the Soviets wouldn't just throw money at something if there hadn't been some hope or expectation that it might pay off. Um, and the CIA, researched it. It ended up with um, actually, it wasn't just the CIA, FTD, Foreign
Hmm.
Technology Division in the Air Force at Wright-Patterson. There was
Oh
an analyst
wow.
there called Dale Graff who was researching this stuff. He came up with a very thick book documenting all of the Warsaw Pact research into all of this stuff.
Hmm.
Anyway, um, so they were very worried about what the heck was going on with the Soviets. Um, they didn't necessarily, when I say they, the CIA didn't necessarily believe there's anything to parapsychology or the paranormal, uh, but the Russians apparently did, and so they were concerned about that.
In one of the videos I did on this topic, there's some amazing document I found that's this long report about all of the perceived potential threats from the Soviets, and it's everything from like influencing thoughts, like psychic peeping on documents, potential even like psychic assassinations, and as again, if you're not initiated into the history of this stuff, and in my opinion, the reality of this stuff, as outlandish as all of that sounds, this caused like real concern, especially because, as you pointed out, we had basically no answer to this. Um, into these programs that apparently the Russians had going for years at this point, right?
That's true. I'm wondering if what you mentioned, was it a document or was it an article?
No, I think this was like a DIA report, or
Oh, okay.
I'm not certain if it was DIA, but yeah, it was an official
Okay, good. That's
long
probably
report.
one of the ones, or the one that Dale Graff worked on. I know most folks listening in won't know who Dale Graff was, but I do want to say that he was one of the least known, most important figures in the Stargate program. He was associated with the program longer than anybody else, 18 years, and mostly behind the scenes, but he played a very important role.
Yeah,
So I'm guessing it was his.
and he become well, I guess from what you're saying, he stays involved. But my knowledge was his involvement later, because he's involved in the Army program, right?
No, he actually was a Defense Intelligence Agency. So Dale started off in roughly around 1975 when he actually saved the remote viewing program from going under. Um, at that time, so I guess there's a little more groundwork to lay here.
Yes.
So in 1972, a physicist at Stanford Research Institute, and I won't go into all the details here, but did an experiment with the person who actually discovered, invented, whatever you want to call it, remote viewing, and named remote viewing. And that guy's name was Ingo Swann.
Yes.
Ingo was a New York City artist, but he was involved in a lot of parapsychology research with some of the credible institutions there. And Hal Puthoff and he got together in Menlo Park at SRI, and they did an experiment that kind of blew the doors off of all of this. Um, and the CIA heard about it, and they came and knocked on Hal's door. And he had circulated this informal kind of pilot study document around to some of his colleagues, and it had ended up on what was laughingly known as the weird desk at the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And so they went and said, "We've been looking for you." And Hal says, "Why me?" He said, "Well, you have clearances. You're a legitimate scientist, and you're looking into this kind of stuff that the Russians have been looking into for years. And we hope that maybe you can help us get a handle on this."
Yes.
And so the CIA gave him $50,000, and they did some research and continued to validate the phenomenon, and it went on from there. But in 1975, the CIA got its self caught with its hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. And they were forced to get rid of anything that was illegal, immoral, or weird.
Mm.
And remote viewing was not illegal, nor was it immoral, but it certainly was weird.
Yes.
And so they canceled the program, and it was Dale Graff who stepped in to save it. He convinced the Air Force that they should fund it from that point. And he kept it going until 1979. And he got crosswise with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a guy named Lou Allen, who didn't like having remote viewing one-upping him all the time. And so Dale ultimately went on to DIA, to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that's where he was until he retired. At the last part of his career, he was actually the branch chief, commander, program director, there's all kinds of different names for him, of the actual physical Stargate program.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this experiment that Ingo did in some ways was sort of the beginnings of remote viewing on a more local level, because part of this experiment was that so it was both like PK and remote viewing in some sense, because the experiment was, could Ingo remotely influence this like highly shielded chip, right? This some kind of chip was, quantum shielded and, was supposed to not be able to be perturbed whatsoever. And he was able to, and I don't know how they measured this, but he was somehow able to perturb this chip and the signals inside of this shielded space multiple times. And one of the ways he said that he did that, from my memory, is that he visualized it. Like he visualized this chip. So you sort of have the beginning of, remote viewing, in that he was somehow psychically viewing this thing and also seeing if he could influence it with some kind of psychokinesis ability. And apparently the results of this were so successful that, as you said, the CIA took notice, and they were like, okay, we're clearly way behind the Russians. We clearly need to know more about this. What is the operational possibilities here with these kinds of techniques? And then SRI, Hal Puthoff, sidebar, Hal is one of the most interesting people to me. Like his, just talk about somebody who's been involved in some of the most interesting sort of X-Files stuff for so many years. Like he's the man, or he's one of the very few. And I'm curious to ask you more about him, if you've had any relationship with him in any way.
Oh, yeah. First off, I want to go off on a sidebar here just for a second. I've heard you interview, and I forget which one of my colleagues it was. Who did you interview most recently?
Um, yeah, there's been a number of people, but our mutual friend Hakeem was on the show.
Hakeem. Yeah, that was the one I remember.
Okay.
Hakeem. Yeah. And what impressed me about you is that you've done your homework.
Oh, thank you.
You already have a lot of background knowledge on this, which makes you an even better interviewer in this subject matter. So I just want to say that's pretty cool. And you've just demonstrated it again. So, yeah. So, well, first of all, the experiment, yeah, it was a quark detector and
Okay.
it had to be shielded multiple different ways in order to guarantee that no environmental interference would occur to it, so that if anything manifests itself, it had to have been a quark because they eliminated all the other possibilities, right? So, made it very hard to do, and none of that had been published. There was no diagram of this machine out on the web. Of course, the web didn't exist back then, but
Right.
um, and there was a chart recorder that actually reported on what was happening internally to this device, and so how they determined that Ingo was actually influencing it was what that chart recorder did.
Okay.
And it did all kinds of weird things that it didn't do before or after, but it did it concurrently with whenever Ingo was directing some kind of attention at it. Um, and the remote viewing part was that he said, I don't even know what to do with this unless I know what it's like inside. So here, let me find out.
Yeah.
And he proceeded to actually sketch a rudimentary sketch of what the internals of this machine was like. And it really impressed Putoff, and I think kind of freaked out the postdoc who was in charge of this machine. And anyway, then it became history from then when the CIA came in. But Putoff started off life as a naval. Well, he got his MS in electrical engineering from Florida. I want to say Florida State, I think, and went in the Navy. He was a naval ROTC officer and spent 3 years actually at NSA in the naval contingent there. So he had already had TSSCI compartmented
Mm,
access to all kinds of things, which was one of the reasons probably he decided he didn't want to make a life as a naval intelligence officer or even a signals intelligence guy. So he went and got his PhD at Stanford
yeah.
and got hired by SRI, partly Stanford Research Institute, partly I think because he did have those clearances.
Yeah.
And so since that time, he's had his finger in a lot of very interesting pots. He's widely known in the free energy world for having investigated zero point energy, the zero point field, and all that extensively. Um, he is very much into the UAP world right now, the UFO UAP world. And not just as a wannabe. He actually regularly briefs Congress, regularly briefs people in the Pentagon. He's been part of a number of these official, but sub rosa behind the scenes,
Yeah.
like ATIP and these. He's been an advisor or a member of these groups. Putoff is probably one of the most legitimate UAP UFO researchers out there, and he's recognized both in industry and by the government as being an expert in that field.
Yeah.
In addition to having essentially, with Ingo's help and Russell Targ, of course, as well, created the remote viewing program. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to make this the Hal put off hour,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean his connections, reaching across what I think are the two of the most interesting topics that seem to be sort of burgeoning in the zeitgeist right now. Because maybe it's just from where I'm sitting, but I feel like there's a
Mhm.
huge reemergence of this interest in psi, remote viewing, all of this stuff, as well as, of course, the UFO UAP phenomenon. And then more
Mhm.
recently, there's been this bridging of those two topics with people like Jake Barber coming forward and talking about like
Mhm.
psionic assets. And you know we can table that for now, but I do want to return to that because in the interest of having some kind of coherent narrative for people that don't know these stories.
Yeah.
So we're in the 70s. They're in the wake of this Ingo Swann experiment, there is some kind of project anointed by the CIA. Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff are these two physicists at SRI who are in charge of this new program to investigate the efficacy of ESP for a number of things.
Mhm.
Eventually, because of Ingo Swann, remote viewing is shown to be something that may be operationally useful, right? Like maybe we can spy on the Russians, maybe we can get intelligence this way. So yeah, please pick it up from there. I know you know this stuff,
Okay.
so I figured I could just kick you to the
Okay,
ball. Yeah.
we're still talking historically. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just had to make sure where we were re-entering the account. Okay, good. Yeah, so the CIA gave him this contract, and then 3 years later, the CIA backed out, and the Air Force took over the funding. In 1977, the Army started looking at setting up their own program, and in '79, this program actually went operational. And some of the folks associated with it. First of all, I also want to give credit to Fred H. Holmes Skip Atwater. We call
Mm-hmm.
him Skip these days.
Mm-hmm.
Skip Atwater, who, as a second lieutenant, was directly tasked by the chief intelligence officer in the Army, General Thompson, to create a remote viewing program, literally. And so now he had Skip, of course, was working with a major. They needed to give him some horsepower, so he was working with a major. But Skip was the one who figured this stuff out to start. And once the program went live, there were some notable folks involved. One was Joe McMoneagle,
Yeah.
who a lot of people, well, almost everybody who knows about remote viewing probably knows about Joe. And Mel Riley was another one who was involved, and other folks who are lesser known because they didn't go public or whatever. But they got the program going in '79. So Joe, he gets his dates all mixed up, but Joe got into the program actually in late '78, roughly around December of '78, and then was read on, became part of the program in '79, early '79. He's the one that did the famous Typhoon submarine
Yeah.
session. I don't know if you want me to go into detail about that, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah. And for sure. Yeah, I think that is a really interesting story because
yeah,
if, one of the common, choruses of skeptics is, oh, this didn't produce anything real. This doesn't, yeah,
yeah,
it's not reliable. Name one major result. And this is a major
yeah,
result.
yeah. And I want to address the major result and not having had any success or whatever. I'll get to that back in a second. But what happened was there was this massive building right on the White Sea in a harbor in, let me think if I remember the name of I think it's Sverdlovsk. Anyway, Russian port city. They had a big naval yard and they had this building there. And the U.S. couldn't find out what was going on inside this building. There was some suspicion of some kind of shipbuilding thing. In fact, one of the working hypotheses was that it was the first Soviet fleet-sized aircraft carrier,
Hmm.
to compete with our aircraft carriers, because the building was big enough to put one and a half of our carriers end to end inside of it. It was massive. I mean, we're talking huge.
Hmm. Hmm.
And but they couldn't get inside to find out what it was. And so ultimately, there was a guy in the National Security Council, a Navy captain, who knew about the remote viewing program. He'd been read on to it. And so he brought this tasking down to the folks who managed the viewers and said, so we got this problem. We got this building. We don't know what's going on inside of it. See if your remote viewers can do something about it. And Joe and Hartley Trent, who's another viewer, he unfortunately, Hartley passed away in 1983, just before I joined the program. But at the time, Hartley did some good stuff too. Joe gets all the credit, but Hartley contributed to this, so I ought to mention his name as well. The two of them worked on this and produced an amazing account, which actually was taken as not serious by the National Security Council.
Yeah.
Joe reported this, and yeah, Joe was responsible for the big part of this. He said he reported this massive submarine, and the way he described it made it bigger than anything that had ever been, any submarine ever been launched before. And the one very specific detail is interesting. He said the missile tubes for the ICBMs that these boomer subs carry, says the missile tubes are in front of the superstructure of the submarine, and instead of behind, as they are with American boats and everybody else, and most Soviets as well, which was a bit of heresy as far as naval architecture was concerned, because the idea is if you have the missile tubes behind the superstructure, you spring a leak, it's not as likely to flood or something. I
Oh,
don't,
okay.
I'm not an expert at this stuff, but something like that. And he said they're in front of the superstructure, on the front end of the boat, and it was just rejected. In fact, Robert Gates was
Yes.
a staffer on the NSC at the time, and he was basically the one who rejected this. Now, Gates becomes significant because ultimately he's the CIA director many
Yes.
years down the road, and he's the one that claimed that anything useful ever came out of the remote viewing program, which I'll get back to that too in a minute. So they rejected what Joe said. Well, ironically, 10 months after these remote viewing sessions were done, they floated out the Typhoon, which was the largest sub ever built, still is the largest sub ever built. And guess where the missile tubes were?
Right.
In front of the superstructure,
Yeah.
just as Joe had described it. And so here's the argument: remote viewing didn't do any good at all here, and it didn't, because they didn't believe it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, 10 months in advance, the remote viewers told the NSC what was in there, and they just rejected that information because it didn't match their a priori, their preconceived
Yeah.
notions of what it should be.
Yeah. So I got to hear that story from Joe because I did a Monroe Institute retreat, and he
Okay.
he came out and surprised us one night and regaled us with all these stories. And yeah, there's so many interesting details about that story because
Mhm.
assuming it's not a he's not adding color to the story. I mean, there's all these details, right? Like you pointed
Well,
out.
with Joe, you can't
Yeah,
necessarily assume
right,
that.
right, yeah. But there's pictures, there's and it's more than just, oh, there's a naval yard. It's logical. You could assume there was a submarine or something. There were reasons why it shouldn't have been. Like, it was some distance from the water
Yeah.
itself, so it
Yeah.
led, like you said, that the NSC was very skeptical because there were all of these facets of the story that made them believe, no, this can't be true. It's too big. It wouldn't be built like that. It's too far away from the shore. It can't be.
Mhm.
It can't be what he's saying. And
Yeah.
I think, according to Joe too, he told them, like, to the day almost, like, it's going to be launched right
Yeah.
around this date.
He
Yeah.
gave them actually a time frame. Um, and I don't know if he said, well, I've got it. I've actually, can I do a little promotion here just for a
Of
second?
course.
So, my book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, I detail this entire project in this book, and including photos and including the sketches that he produced, and some of the verbal content and all that stuff.
Awesome.
And he said, uh, if I remember correctly, he said, by a certain date in the future, which was essentially 10 months out from when they were doing this project, I get the impression of this massive submarine alongside a pier, with hoses and stuff going to it. And they have satellite photos from that period that are exactly at the time what Joe had predicted. So he didn't exactly give them a date, but he did give them a time hack that really matched what
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one great example. And I know we kind of have to go back in time here to reintroduce Pat Price and some of his
Mhm.
incredible hits, but he's so central to a lot of this lore too. And then there's all these juicy details, surrounding
Yeah.
his mysterious demise.
Mhm.
I did a video a few weeks back, actually, where I covered a lot of his story, including his strange death.
Well, it's say, let me say a little bit on it. So Pat actually just wandered in off the street at SRI.
Yeah.
They were doing their research, and he'd got wind of it. And I'm a little reluctant to raise this connection, but I really should. Pat was a Scientologist,
Yes.
and at the time, so was Hal, and
Yes.
so was Ingo, and so was Ed May, who
Okay.
was also a scientist there, right?
And can we
Um,
zoom out on the history of this a little bit? Because today
okay.
Scientology has certain connotations, and
Mhm.
I just don't know, because I don't know the history of it, what it was like then when it was newer on the scene. I assume L. Ron Hubbard was still alive Whether I don't know if that makes it
Yeah,
better or
he
not,
was.
but
In fact, I think he was out on their Sequest or whatever they called their ship. I think, if I
okay.
remember, he was pretty much of a kind of a hermit of sorts, right?
Okay.
He dealt with the public and the rest of Scientology kind of through lieutenants that were working with him, right? But yeah, so this would have been, well, it was Price showed up in '73, and Scientology was fairly new, and it was certainly as controversial, or maybe more so back then.
Okay.
Um, but I don't know if Scientology played a role here, but I'm wondering if that's maybe how Price heard about it, is through Scientology circles,
Interesting.
because it was kind of an open secret that Puthoff was working, and Swan was working in this stuff.
Hmm.
So anyway, he shows up, and he had wore a lot of different hats over time. Um, oh, here's a little sidebar. Sorry,
Yeah.
sidebar
Yeah.
squirrel. So I live in Utah now. I used
Mhm.
to live in Austin. Before that, I was in the Army, and we enjoyed Austin, but we moved here to Utah, and I've gotten a better grasp of the history. Pat Price actually was born in Salt Lake.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Ingo Swann, uh, his formative years were in Tooele, outside of Salt Lake. So there's a Utah connection here. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I just ended up here, So
Mhm.
so that was fun. Sorry, that's probably meaningless and not of particular use, but I find it interesting. So Price comes in. He'd been a police commissioner
Yeah.
for the city of Burbank.
Yes.
He'd been a lot of other things as well. Um, but as he was doing police work and such, he developed this, as Stephen Schwartz, no, is it Schwartz? Might have been Marcello Truzzi calls it the blue sense, which is a kind of this cop's sense that something's not going right,
Mm.
or where to go to solve the crime, whatever kind of stuff like that. And Price seemed to have that in spades. I mean, he was remarkable in some of the stuff he did. Now, he was wrong on some cases too. Everybody's wrong, and people don't understand that remote viewing is not 100%, no matter how good you are as a remote viewer. Price got some stuff wrong, but when he got it right, it was just amazing what he came up with. And I don't know if you want any stories about that, but when he did the research, actual just laboratory style research for SRI, he got some just direct hits. I mean, they've been criticized over the years. Now that's a whole nother topic. Let's not go into that. But the criticisms, I did some extensive for my dissertation. I did some extensive research into those criticisms, and I find they don't hold water. They were
Interesting.
essentially skeptics trying to justify how these things could have been done other than by ESP, and the criticisms just don't get there if you really know what the background is to them.
Yeah, unless you're assuming some widespread willful cheating, and you probably, with all the deep research you've done, probably know how the experiments were structured, so this wouldn't be
Mhm.
possible. And unless the details of the story, as an exoteric onlooker, something like his semi-Palantinsk drawings, or
Mhm.
his viewing of the NSA facility, like these are two of
Mhm.
Pat Price's most famous um hits that have been told widely in podcasts and documentaries,
Mhm.
like Third Eye Spies, Annie Jacobson's book Phenomena,
Mhm.
etc. And even just seeing that, it's just confounding. Like it's I don't understand how you could construe it as anything other than what it is. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
unless somebody handed Pat Price a drawing and said, "Here, copy this drawing," which apparently wasn't verified by satellites until much later. And I'll flash these drawings up here so people know what I'm talking about. Like, this isn't. This is clear. It's not like, oh yeah, I guess it kind of looks like that. I mean, it's basically a blueprint the guy
Mhm.
drew of the place.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. And of course, other folks have been able to do that as well. Joe
Yeah.
McMonagle's been able to do it. Um, I mean, I've been able to do it. Some of my students have been able to do it. A number of the CRVers, the controlled remote viewers at Fort Meade that either I helped train or were trained alongside of me, have been able to do it. But Price was so consistent, and he was whatever this term means, he was untrained. He was kind of a natural off the street
Mm.
remote viewer from everything I've been able to tell. He just did some amazing remote viewing that has certainly never been topped. It may have been equaled, but it's never been topped in the, what, 50-ish years?
Wow.
I think it's been more than 50 years, hasn't it? Am
Yeah.
I counting correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So,
incredible. So one of the, the juiciest aspects of his story is because of his prowess, he's essentially poached by the CIA, right? So for where
yes.
he enters into like a direct um relationship with the CIA. He has a CIA
Mhm.
handler. He's being tasked by the CIA directly
Mhm.
now. And what's interesting is, at least according to, I think this is both in Third Eye Spies and Phenomena, again, this Annie Jacobson book. Apparently his files, with whatever he was doing at the CIA to this day, remain classified, which is sort of an interesting, um, point of intrigue, that we're not really clear on what he was doing for this span of a couple years where he was
Yeah.
working directly with them.
And I don't know about the files part, but I certainly can understand why they would be, because I mean he was dealing with targets
Mhm.
and associated the confirmatory stuff would have been how do you want to say this, would have been involved sources and methods that probably are still sensitive today,
Wow.
right? So I could imagine. Now there's probably, if it hasn't been, there's probably material in there that could be declassified if someone knew how to ask for it.
Okay.
Probably. So that's part of the problem with a Freedom of
Mm.
Information Act thing. You have to know how to ask. In other words, if it's like a search on the web, if you don't get your search string right, you may be close, but not close enough for it to recognize what you want.
Yeah.
And with FOIAs, it's kind of like that too. You got to tell them what it is you want and be close enough that they can actually find it
Do you think you
in
could get
literally
something if you
millions of
tried?
records. Say again?
Do you think you could get something if you tried?
Well, see, I don't know what I'm looking for as far as
Okay.
what he did at the CIA. I mean, you could put out a kind of a blanket request, everything having to do with Pat Price and the CIA files, and maybe you'd get something. Um, I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Can
yeah, but anyway, it's a, I don't know what conversation you had about Pat Price's death. Um,
Well, it's mostly, so I mostly covered the chapter in that, and I know there's mixed feelings. It seems like from people who were inside the programs on this Annie
mhm,
Jacobson book, but for me, as just again somebody who doesn't know all the ins and outs, it was a great read. But um, her summary of it essentially is that he, at this point in time, has left SRI. He's working for the CIA. He actually
mhm,
meets up with Hal and Russell Targ in Las Vegas. They're having dinner together.
mhm,
um, he feels ill, goes up to his room at the Stardust Hotel. They don't hear from him for a while. They go up and check on him, and he's in his bed in cardiac arrest. So they
mhm.
call 911. Uh, Ambulance comes to get him. Kit Green, the I guess he's like the contract monitor at this point, right?
Yeah, of course he was an MD
Yes.
and such. So, but yeah.
So yeah, there's this character we haven't introduced, at least in this conversation, named Kit Green. He's an
Mhm,
MD, as Paul says, who's sort of the oversight for this remote viewing project. He personally flies out when he hears about what happened to Pat Price, and shows up at the hospital. Body isn't there, and it's like this. He's just confused. Like, according to protocol, his body should be here. There should have been an
mhm,
autopsy done. What the hell's going on? And according to whoever he talks to, he passed away of a heart attack, so there was no need or something like that. But
mhm,
there are all these reasons to believe that maybe it wasn't natural causes. Like, some people suspect the CIA, some people suspect the Russians, some people suspect
mhm.
the Scientologists. Um,
Yeah,
so there's all this intrigue around his death, and
yeah.
there's even
Just
some.
to mention, the body did eventually show up. I don't
Okay,
remember if you said that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if I know that story. What? How did the?
Yeah, so it just mysteriously appeared. When I say mysteriously appeared, it was there one time, and then or it wasn't there, and then it was,
Okay.
and nobody saw the delivery. Right, the body was picked up by an ambulance, uh, uh, and Then it didn't show up where it was supposed to for 24 hours. And about 24 hours later, according to the accounts, one of whom is Hal. I've talked to Hal about this a fair amount. Um, it then was there, and that's never been explained. That missing time. It's an interesting, different kind of missing time
Right.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, and a lot of people believe the CIA did it, but that makes no sense, none whatsoever, because Price was actually working for them. They had all kinds of strings on him. They had no need to take him out. But and this I know from my own first person. 2 weeks before he died, he told his daughter, let me explain that. So my book, Reading the Enemy's Mind, which is an account of the remote viewing program, came out in 2005. And just a couple of weeks after it came out, I get a phone call from Pat Price's daughter saying, "Oh, I'm really glad that you talked about my dad and blah, blah, blah and stuff." And we started talking about his death. And she said, 2 weeks before he died, he told me, if anything happens to me, it was the KGB that did it.
Wow.
And if you think about it, they're the ones with the most motivation to take him out,
Sure.
because the only real defense against a remote viewer is to eliminate them. There's never been any documented way of blocking remote viewers from accessing a target. You get people who make all kinds of claims, but that happens in the remote viewing world. You hear all kinds of claims.
Yeah.
And if you track them down, you find out there's no substance to them. And that's one of them. There's never been that you can block it. There's never been any, and SRI researched this. They even have a paper out on this explaining they were not able to find any kind of a blocking mechanism. And so that was one of the reasons why the Stargate program, was so classified. The highest classification in the program, they had 4 different levels. The highest level was the names, the locations of the remote viewers, because they were trying to protect them from being neutralized by any enemy or opponent out there that didn't want to be remote viewed. And so the KGB had the most motivation for getting rid of Pat Price of anybody. And on top of that, the MO fits. They had techniques where they had poisons that would mimic heart attacks, and very hard to detect. And so my suspicion, I think maybe Hal shares this, is that they're the ones who they poisoned him. He died. And then they spirited the body away for 24 hours so that any residual signature of that chemical would have dissipated. So there would be no way that it could be determined not to have been an accident.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly sounds plausible. Everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. One of the more out there conjectures I've heard, and I don't even know if the timing lines up with this because I'm not historical enough on when he made these viewings, but one of the more out there conjectures is that somehow he got too close to something by, this famous case where he apparently remote viewed the 4 alien bases or apparent alien bases. Does that timing even potentially line up to your knowledge?
Well, the alien bases were before he worked for the CIA. I want to say it might have been late 73. I don't know how would have a better grasp of that.
Okay.
Actually, so I have copies of Price's stuff, so maybe there's a date in there. I don't remember.
Interesting.
Skip Atwater published a book called Project 8200, in which he documents a lot of the Pat Price material. If folks want to get that, they may be able to find that themselves. But So I'm actually making a note here.
Cool. Yeah, and
to look into later.
And for anybody that doesn't know, you also, unbeknownst to you, are tasked with viewing one of these same apparent alien bases as Pat Price, but we'll get to that eventually. But
okay.
So I think we've done a general lap around those SRI years now. We started going into the Army program already, so I feel like we might as well get into your recruiting and your experience, because you had no idea this existed. You were, and what were you doing when you got recruited?
So I had just gotten back from 3 years in Germany as a tactical and strategic intelligence officer for a special forces unit over there. I was not special forces, but I did get to hang out with them, and that was pretty fun. Um, I'd gone through the Army Officer Advanced course, which is 6 months, a 6 month long course in Arizona, and had just been assigned to Fort Meade, working for an Army human intelligence organization called Army Ops Group as a Mideast desk analyst.
Okay.
I was a Mideast specialist at the time. I was somewhat competent in both Hebrew and Arabic, and I was
Oh,
interested in the
wow.
Middle East and done a lot of things associated with it. And so I got hired to do this job. Hired in the Army, you get assigned, I guess. You're always hired unless they get rid of you. Um, well, there's a whole interesting story here that I won't go into. It takes time too, but I I hadn't realized it, of course, but I had moved in next door to Skip Atwater,
Aha.
across the street from Tom McNair, who was a remote viewer in training. And they were both wore civilian clothes, even though their doors said Captain McNair and Captain Atwater. And Tom had a beard, and I mean, totally atypical. Although folks who are in the human intelligence realm, particularly if they're case officers or whatever, will often be have relaxed dress standards and encouraged to dress differently and all that. And so I figured they were human, but I got into a conversation with them a couple of times trying to figure out what they did. And I said, well, are you guys in a human organization? They said, no. I said, okay. Well, what do you do? They said, we can't tell you. I said, I know that, but you can at least tell me which intelligence discipline you're in. Are you in signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, human intelligence, measurement and signatures intelligence? What? They said, none of those. I said, there isn't anything else. What do you mean, none of those? And then I said, well, thinking this might reveal something. You say, do you do a lot of traveling? And they said, no. And then Tom said, well, sort of.
Yeah.
So, that made no sense to me. But later on, they knock on my door, and both of them came over and said, look, we think you might be good at what we do. And of course, I said, what do you do? And they said, we can't tell you yet. I said, well, how do I know? And they said, we're going to give you some tests. And I took some psychology tests, some personality profile tests, and those kind of things. and apparently I scored where they wanted me to, because they took me over to the office and read me on to the program. And I joke, it's kind of like my Men in Black moment where, Tommy Lee Jones is reading Will Smith onto the Men in Black program.
Yeah.
You'll have your fingerprints erased, you'll sever all human connections, blah, blah, blah. It was kind of like that, because
Wow.
I had been read on to top secret, special compartment intelligence, gamma, delta, and another caveat, all of these different levels of intelligence access. And this read on was more strict than anything I'd done
Wow.
before. It
Crazy.
was kind of bizarre. Anyway, then Tom says, what we do is we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline known as remote viewing. Basically, we want to invite you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And he said, now you don't have to tell me till tomorrow. You can have 24 hours to think it over. Here's the 3 things you can tell your wife about this, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I don't need any of that.
Yep.
I absolutely want to do this.
Yep. I'm with you, man. I'm there, baby. As soon as I heard that, I'm like, I would absolutely be.
Yeah.
Where do I sign up?
Yeah.
And do you have any sense of why they thought you might be a good candidate? Because you hear these stories that from people like McMonigal, and I think David Morehouse, there's some kind of precipitating reason why, like, they survived something, they had some sort of anomalous experience. Like, I think in David Morehouse's case, he, during a training exercise,
Yeah.
got hit by a machine gun round and had like an out of body experience. That sort of,
Yeah. That's made up.
really? Okay.
Yeah. Now, he did get hit by a machine gun round. It hit his helmet.
Okay.
In fact, he was quite proud of it. He had it still hanging on his wall at his house.
Wow.
The round had cooked off. So if a machine gun's hot and they close the bolt and they're still around in the chamber, sometimes the heat will make it fire.
Mhm.
And the round had come over and it actually hit the lip of his helmet. And Kevlar, of course, is made out of a sandwich of materials. And and the bullet had tunneled up, and I knocked him down. It stunned him,
Hmm.
but and if it had been an inch higher or an inch lower, it probably would have killed him. But the helmet actually did its job here.
Yeah.
Um, but all of that stuff about out of body experience, all that stuff, that was something that came long after he'd ever been in the program.
Wow.
When he wrote Psychic Warrior, uh, I guess it made a better story. I don't know, but he
Okay.
did not get recruited because of any kind of out of body experience or anything. So
Okay. So
yeah,
that's
so
another piece of lore you just may be familiar with from, other sort of uh psi paranormal things that oftentimes s- there's like a relationship between some sort of traumatic event that
mhm.
begins people's ability to do these things. But it seems like in your case and a lot of other people's cases, this was not a
Yeah.
necessary component.
In fact, they wanted, at least when SRI was working this, they wanted to avoid those kind of things.
Hmm.
Because what would often happen is a person would have an experience and they start building this whole structure of explanation and justification stuff around it. And then there'd be a whole bunch of stuff to unlearn when they came to the program, right? It would
Okay.
kind of taint them as a trainee in a way, right? For example, Joe did have some apparently quasi paranormal experiences, but that wasn't why he came on board. They may not have even known about that when he first came on. um, how
Yeah.
those first six viewers were recruited was they Skip and Scotty Watt, the major that was he was working with, circulated a I can only think of the German word Meinungsumfrage. Uh, I guess a study or survey. That's I think they're working for a survey amongst intelligence professionals in the DC area. Um, and there's mostly kind of straightforward questions, but there would be little ones like how do you feel about paranormal,
Hmm.
and people who answered paranormal and everything to do with that's nonsense. They didn't approach them, but if there was an indication that the person might actually be interested, then they would interview that person
Hmm.
because that meant they were open at least to the
Yeah.
idea. And they eliminated some folks who were just too over the top, and folks who seemed to be fairly grounded, then they would move them along to the next set of interviews and such. And ultimately, they let SRI Targ and Putoff actually came out and selected they were going to select three, but they said these are all good. Can we have six? So they gave them six, right? And
Cool.
amongst them were Mel Riley and Hartley Trent and Joe and some other folks as well.
Hmm.
So uh,
So,
but yeah, in my case, I didn't have a paranormal experience. Tom McNair didn't have one as a precipitating factor for this. Joe did have them, but that wasn't the reason he got selected. Mel Riley, same thing. I could go through the whole list, and not really any of us did.
hmm, interesting.
Uh, yeah,
So what is the process of being onboarded onto this like? Are like I've heard some, I don't remember where I heard this, but like that there's all these files you had to read to sort of like get sped up on why they like how this may work. I don't know. I don't know what the contents of what they showed you was, but
yeah.
what do you remember or what can you talk about if you
So
can
there
talk about
was no required reading, but there's recommended reading.
it? Okay.
One of them, everybody was universally encouraged to read Mind Reach, which was the
Yeah.
book by Targ and Putoff, published in '77. And that's actually the book that got Skip Atwater interested in remote viewing as well. He came across that, and all of a sudden, all kinds of lights went on and said, "Wow, if this is real, it could be a threat to our security." And he was a counterintelligence officer
Hmm.
at the time. So yeah, so MindReach was the one for sure. There were certainly plenty of other documents. There was the the document Dale Graff had written, and the other one which I think he may have written as well, Paraphysics and the Paraphysics and something or other. I can't remember what it's called exactly. There's an interesting story about those too, having to do with Skip Atwater, but maybe you'll get him on sometime.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Wow, and I have to go clear back. We were encouraged to read actually a lot of arcane stuff that we came across ourselves. Like at the time, I didn't really know what was appropriate to read and what wasn't, so I read a number of Ruth Montgomery books. She was a medium of sorts. I Lobsang Rampa, I read
Oh,
some of
okay.
his stuff.
Is he like a
Um,
Tibetan
huh?
teacher? Tibetan?
I think he was actually American, but he'd adopted.
Okay.
Yeah, and he was
Yeah.
into mediumship, into I think, and I can't remember the name of the book, but I think it had Third Eye in it, which
Mm.
is an interesting coincidence
Hmm.
here, right, for your podcast.
What about like Bentov?
Um, we could have read that. I didn't because it
Okay.
didn't really seem to me. At the time, I didn't know a lot about it.
Okay.
Of course, you couldn't get on the web and read a review or anything.
Right.
Um, and
Yeah.
even now, I don't know that it would be that useful in terms of if you're
Mhm.
going to want to learn remote viewing. So,
Sure. Yeah. I just mean maybe, some of the theory and like,
yeah,
physics ideas and ideas about consciousness and all of
yeah.
that. Clearly, I'm assuming you're familiar with the declassified gateway
The gateway
process paper,
document.
and yes,
Yes.
and how
Oh,
heavily
that just keeps coming up.
well, yes, I mean, and for me as someone who went to Monroe, I couldn't resist diving into all of that,
Yeah.
and he
Well, let me say the gateway document is an interesting and worthwhile read.
yeah,
The problem is that when the media gets a hold of it, they blow it way out of proportion. They
yes,
say the CIA proved life after death or
right,
whatever. Or, first of all, it wasn't the CIA. This was an Army produced
right.
document before it didn't have anything to do with the CIA. It just happened to be in the CIA Stargate archives, which happened to be the CIA archives because Congress made them take it.
And I will personally apologize to you and the public. I do these things for clickbait too, knowing full well
Yes.
that it's not
Yes.
accurate, but it gets clicks, and I try to get people into the content and then give them good research stuff once they get in. Um, but but yeah, on that note, there's I wanted to ask you too about did you know is it Wayne McDonnell who wrote that document? Lieutenant Colonel
Yeah, I think that was his name, or O'Donnell. I can't. I'm not remember right now. He was actually Lieutenant Colonel. He was the
Lieutenant
commander
Colonel.
of
Okay.
Det O, which was a subunit of the Army Ops Group where I was first assigned before going to the remote
Okay.
viewing program.
Point of personal
Um,
interest for me because when you
mhm.
not much you can find about him out there. So
No,
yeah, I was curious.
no, I happen to know some folks who knew him, and
Okay.
so I've talked to them a little bit. But even they didn't have a lot to say about him other than what his position was. The story. So the colonel that was my commander at Ops Group and the guy responsible for letting me go to the remote viewing program. Yeah, I'd only worked for his name was Hambrick, John Hambrick,
Hmm.
great guy, true war hero, great guy. Anyway, I'd only worked for him for about 3 months. And then I get this invitation to join the remote viewing program. And he didn't have to let me go because the commander, particularly first year or so that you're with, can declare you operationally essential
Hmm.
and nobody can pry you loose except in a national emergency. And so I went in and told him I was being recruited for this program, which he knew about. He'd been read onto it. And he said, you know what? I, I love having you here. But if you can do something more important for national security by being a remote viewer, then you have my blessing.
Wow.
And he turned me loose. Anyway, he was interested in all this stuff, the leading edge, the human potentials movement, all that,
Cool.
partly because his commander, General Bert Stubblebine,
Yeah.
was very fascinated and interested in this. And of course, Bert Stubblebine's action officer for this was John Alexander. A lot of folks probably are familiar with him. But Stubblebine was interested in it, and Hambrick. Hambrick was equally interested, and he had his own little project. He had a couple of folks, including my friend John Nolan, who are out there at least as part-time exploring this material as well. And McDonnell or O'Donnell, I'll have to look it up again now. Both names are stuck in my
I think it
head.
is McDonnell. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll keep saying McDonnell then. Anyway, Hambrick needed somebody. He wanted somebody to evaluate the Monroe program, the Monroe Institute program, and so he assigned McDonnell to do it. And McDonnell goes down, and he took a gateway program,
Hmm.
and then he interviewed. I think now it's been a while, but I think he interviewed Bob Monroe
Hmm.
and maybe some other folks associated with it. And then he cross-referenced that with Bentov
Yeah.
and who's the other guy who was doing popularized consciousness physics? There's the Dancing Woolly Masters. There's the In Search of the Wild Pendulum. Those are two
Yeah, yeah,
different
Stalking
authors.
the Wild Pendulum. Yeah, that's Bentov.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, Woolly
He's
Master.
really the one throughout the paper that is. So I
They
read
come
that
through
whole
the most.
document on the channel,
Yeah,
and he's really, they do, they reference Bohm and they reference other physics ideas, but he's really the one who you can tell
is a
he
source of,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, so Monroe wouldn't have put those two together, right? The Bentov stuff and his own program,
I,
but he certainly
hmm,
would have endorsed it if it got him traction. Right?
got it. Got
Bob
it.
was really he really, of course, wanted to promote what he was doing,
Yeah.
and at that time, it wasn't because it was making him a lot of money, because it wasn't. It's because it was something he really believed in. Bob Monroe was really, really uh, sincere about pursuing this other branch or other aspect of human consciousness. And so I'm sure he would have been fine with it. But this document that McDonald produced was really his baby. It
Hmm.
really was. And he wasn't doing it. You can kind of read it and say, well, he wasn't even doing it for Hambrick, really.
Totally. Yeah.
He was kind
Yeah.
of doing it for himself, and it
Yeah.
came out really quite amazing. A lot of it's speculative.
Yeah.
Some people take it as literally true, and it isn't necessarily. But it isn't false either. It's speculative, trying to figure out how these pieces go together. It's kind of a self exploration of the consciousness universe, and
Yeah.
it's a great document. I just
Yeah.
people just tend to misunderstand it.
Other than the run-on sentences, which are brutal, especially
Yeah,
trying to read
well,
it out
yeah.
loud.
Hey, the guy
But
was an army officer. What do you think?
yeah, yeah, but no, amazingly, amazingly well researched, really
Yeah.
challenging to try to encapsulate the practicality of the method, talking about the focus levels, and then also as a non-scientist, I'm assuming, I don't know his full background, but trying to
Mhm.
get the scientific, theoretical, philosophical ideas all smashed together in one document. That's a challenging undertaking.
Yeah, and to his credit, he did a pretty decent job of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that this is a bit far afield from
Mhm.
specifically what you did, though I think I heard you say that did you go to Monroe Institute at one point?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So eventually that at least tangentially comes into your experience, but
Yeah, well, let me give you a
sure.
little more chronology there. So I was recruited into the program, officially joined the program on the 1st of September in 1983. And in December of 83, I and Ed Dames, who you're probably familiar with that name,
Mhm, mhm.
uh, were sent down to Monroe by the Army. Well, yeah, Army technically, but it was, from Stubblebind's headquarters, sent down
Mm,
to the Army, as they thought they considered it to be a good preparatory experience for getting remote viewing training, CRV training. So we went down and did a gateway program, and that was quite an experience. I could go into more detail on that too, but I think I'll skip it for now. Um, but yeah, so we used HemiSync. So the main technology of the Monroe Institute is this thing called HemiSync, where
yes.
it's an audio technique where you play just out of phase tune. So
Mhm.
one sound in one ear and then another sound that's just slightly out of phase from it, and you're able to establish a frequency following response inside the brain, where both hemispheres, get on the same wavelength. So you
Right.
like my graphics here? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
so,
Yeah,
so get on
I'll
this.
throw some I'll make sure to leave your hands up, but I'll also put
Yeah.
some footage
Okay.
up too. Yeah.
Okay. Fine. So so you essentially attune both hemispheres to the same frequency, spoken very roughly.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's thought that this actually enhances the ability of the hemispheres to work together. And the ultimate goal at the Monroe Institute is to get you in the right frame to have an out of body experience. Um, Frequently, it doesn't
Right.
accomplish that, because I'm sure there's other variables involved, but it does happen sometimes for some folks who go there.
Yeah.
Um, but we used it as a kind of a cool down, cool down in quotes
Yeah.
here, cool down mechanism, where before we did particularly what we called ERV, or extended remote viewing, um, we would listen to a Focus 10 or a Focus 12 tape. We were using cassette tapes back then, and get us in a kind of a frame, a unified hemispheric condition, where we would be more amenable or conducive to receiving a remote viewing input.
Interesting.
And I think it worked. I mean, it could have been placebo effect but it seemed to work. And the one of the interesting things about Hemosync is that once you understand what it feels like, you can kind of self-induce
Yes.
without the signal even. And so I think I probably still do that a little bit, even after all these years. When I do a remote viewing session, is sort of self-induced, a synchronized hemispheric state. And if it doesn't work, it certainly doesn't hurt.
Right.
I do think it does have some benefit to remote viewing functioning in the long term. So
Yeah, it's very interesting, and with I won't tell my story for the millionth time, but just so you're somewhat aware of my experience. I was having a great experience during my gateway retreat, um, punctuated by occasional just sudden images popping in and interesting phenomenology, but mostly just very meditative, very relaxed, very self-reflective. And then to
mhm.
my great surprise, Paul, on the last day of the retreat, I had a full blown OBE,
Oh,
and it was
awesome.
very ontologically destabilizing. Like for about
Mhm.
a full day, I was just walking around, just shaking my head, just being like, "That happened. Oh, okay," and just kind of like. I'm here, but that can happen. And for about the next few days, I was every time I'd go to bed, I'd be like, "Ugh," like I
Is that going to happen
yeah, is it
again?
gonna happen again? And it really didn't happen like that. And again, just in case you're curious, I didn't have any super mind-blowing, uh, you know, being splayed across, the universe or anything. I really did just stay in my check unit and like achieve liftoff, and the full-blown sensation of oh my god, this is happening, like, and the rushing of energy sensation, um and then trying to get control of it and really not being able to, and then just the fear really setting in,
Hmm.
and physically, or I don't know, astrally asking for help. And then eventually I just kind of went back down, popped out of
Mhm.
the check unit, went downstairs, and just sort of shook my head. But
You
yeah,
got a Diet Coke.
you're right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, so that was my experience. But anyway, and maybe we can wrap up the Monroe chapter, because it does seem to be tangential to your experience, and I don't want to dwell too long on it. But um, it is this interesting sort of. It feels like other than the fact that you use it for your cool down procedure, and for people who haven't heard this before, there's this idea that you sort of get into a meditative, calm state before you do a viewing, right? And they call that the
Mhm.
cool down
Yeah.
period, where you're sort of separating yourself from the day and whatever you have on your mind, and you know whatever,
Yeah.
and doing one of these binaural beat uh hemisync meditations helps get you into
It's one
that
approach. Yeah.
state. Yeah.
Yeah. I used to actually listen to heavy metal.
No, yeah, I love heavy music too. Yeah.
But I actually, just to toss in, you don't have to do a cool down to have success at remote viewing. I want people to know that. In fact, for me, I thought it got to be a bit of a crutch,
Hmm.
and so I really don't bother with it anymore. It did add another 15 or 20 minutes to the length of a session, for one thing.
Right.
And when you're living under perpetual time constraints, it's maybe not it's a good thing not to have so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, but you should be able to do remote viewing under any condition, and so I've kind of got myself away from the perceived need to do a cool down. But at the time, it was helpful, particularly since we were just starting out. We were just novices at this, and having something that a sort of a ritual to get
Yeah.
into was really pretty helpful. So
So once you're in, you have the method. What is a typical day like? I mean, from the logistical to the taskings themselves, what, like, are you being tasked daily? Like, what is it like being part of this
so
unit?
are you talking specifically about Fort Meade? Is
Yes.
that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So once we'd done all of our training and we were working as operational remote viewers, the rule was for long term, we rarely did more than one session a day because it's easy to get burned out.
Yeah.
If you do enough, you get to the point where you don't care, and then you start phoning it in, and your work suffers, right? And we didn't do operational, that is real world taskings every day. It was like every other day. And days when we weren't doing real world, we do uh, essentially practice targets,
Mm.
because a lot of of course, most of our real world targets were intelligence collection efforts. And we oftentimes wouldn't get feedback for a long time or ever. And feedback in a remote viewing session is essential so you can learn and so you can keep your skills tuned up. If you can't find out what the target was for months and years, even sometimes, um, then your edge can slip and you don't even know it because you don't have anything to compare to. So we would do practice targets where there was known feedback, and a lot of them were what we called utility assessment targets, which might be real world targets, but the ground truth was already known about them. And so we would go in, like maybe it was a Soviet anti-ballistic missile radar and outside of Tashkent or something, right? We'd go in and do that target, and then we could get actually feedback on it
Right.
after the fact. And so we can compare what we got with what we could have gotten or should have gotten, and see where we need to tweak our process a little bit, or at least reassure us that we're still getting on the signal and all that. So it was a good, it was actually operationally essential to do that kind of thing, to make sure when we were doing targets that we didn't know the ground truth, that nobody knew the ground truth of, we had a higher probability that we were doing it correctly.
Mm. What is the moment for you where this really clicked in terms of you understanding, okay, this is real. I can do this. Like, holy shit. This is like, this has gone from a theoretical thing and a process I'm trying to something that is, I just demonstrated to myself is real. Do you remember that moment?
Yes, that was the donut story.
Ah, okay.
So when I first got into the program, and this was before Monroe, not that that matters. Uh, in fact, it was like a week or two after I'd been assigned and got my desk. In fact, I mentioned Hartley Trent had passed away. I got his desk, which made me a little nervous at first. I
Mm.
was hoping there wasn't bad juju
You're right.
associated with it. But um, one of the processes, one of the experimental paradigms is called outbounder, which is where a an outbound team, that's one, two, three people, go to a randomly selected target, physically go to a target, and then the viewer is expected to find these people. They act like beacons in a sense,
Mhm.
lighting up the target. Here we are. This is where you're supposed to be, right? That's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
And so then the viewer will be in a sequestered room, maybe with an interviewer. Usually it was, we'd be in there with Skip because he was our training officer. Um, and then the remote viewer would remote view the target, and then the outbound team would come back, get the viewer and take that person out to the target where they get real time feedback. Okay, so Tom and Charlene was another is a woman who's trained with me, and another guy named Bill Ray who
Mhm.
gets mentioned every now and again.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, Charlene and Tom were the outbound team, and they, drew a random target, and they were sent to this huge water tower just north of Fort Meade, a little ways. It was blue. It was one of those that looks like a giant spider, where you've got the big dome and a
Uh-huh.
central pillar, and then all of the pipes around the outside. Right.
Okay. Yep.
So they go there. They spend their 15 minutes walking around, banging on the pipes, hugging the pipes, I don't know, whatever. And then they came back, and they came in, and they were along with them. They brought some donuts, and we're eating the donuts, and they're taking me out there, and I get to the water tower, and I'm looking at it saying, I got nothing. What I had gotten was a room with frosted light coming in, little kind of spindly tables and chairs, windows with little lacy curtains in them, and off in the end, a glass partition with some things behind it or whatever. And so I'm describing this, and I'm now I realize that Skip's sort of saying, where the heck is he? That's not in our target base at all, right? Anyway, we're coming back from the water tower, and I'm thinking, oh no, I got nothing. They're going to, in fact, that water tower is about the color of my shirt. I just realized. Anyway, we're coming back, and I'm thinking, I'm going to be fired. And I've only been here a week, and we're going down the road, and all of a sudden I say, my attention is drawn off to the side. I say, what's over there? And Skip, who had figured out what was going on, said, he didn't say what it was. He said, if you don't get the target, it doesn't matter what you get instead. And I go, what? He said, never mind, let's go over there. So they turned off the road, went over and walked in, and there's this room with frosted light coming in, frilly curtains, little tables with chairs, and a counter in the back, glass front with donuts in it.
Interesting.
And what had happened was the outbound team had violated protocol. You're supposed to go straight to the target and straight back. You're not supposed to deviate. Mm-hmm. Well, they'd gotten hungry for donuts. They stopped in the donut shop. So I had picked that up, right? I picked up the donut shop. And in fact, amusingly, my father-in-law later, when I told him the story, said, yep, trust you to find the donuts.
Wow.
So anyway, so what I learned a number of lessons from that, but the main one was that it actually did work, because when I saw what I had remote viewed, I knew for a fact that I had remote viewed it. So I knew it worked. Now, it may not have worked the way it was supposed to work for me, but that was another lesson I learned. I learned the importance of keeping your intention on the task. And not allowing yourself to deviate from that. And you do have some control over that as a viewer. You don't know what the target is, but you do know that you're supposed to be fixed on what the intended target is and nothing else. So anyway, that's when I knew it worked. A week into the thing, I knew it worked.
Wow.
I didn't know if I was going to be successful at it even then, but I knew at least I had some capacity. So
what are some other occasions, viewings, moments that really stick out to you that, and by the way, are any of these still classified, or has this pretty much all come out now?
So,
like, I don't know if there's occasions that you're like, oh, there's one, but I can't talk about it.
Yeah. And there's probably somewhere I can say, well, I'd have to say, at least I can't talk about some of it. Right.
Got it.
But generally speaking, as far as I have been able to tell, all of the operational remote viewing sessions, all of the training sessions, all the practice sessions, all that stuff, all of that was released in the CIA Stargate archives.
Okay.
And let me give you a little history of that. So people call them the Stargate archives, but actually what they are the contents of the 13 5-drawer safes that we had in the headquarters building at the project. And when the whole program was transferred over to the CIA in 1995, the CIA instantly canceled it. Literally, it transferred on January 30 or June 30th, 1995. On June 30th, 1995, the CIA closed it down. They never actually ran it. But what they did inherit was all of these 5 drawers. So what's 5 times 13? That's 65 safe drawers full of classified documents having to do with Stargate program. Now, there were also classified documents within the CIA that weren't part of that. And there were a ton of research documents that Ed May, the research scientist that took over for Hal Puthoff when Puthoff moved on in 1985, all of those, none of those are really in this release. Okay. They just took the stuff we had at Fort Meade and declassified that.
Okay. After
redacting some stuff. Usually all the redaction had to do with the evaluations, the confirmation and stuff, because that gave the targets away. The raw data, the actual operational remote viewings are there. But without knowing what the target was, they don't do you any good.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that I know what a lot of those targets were. So selectively, I acknowledge them. I say selectively because one of the reasons you classify stuff like that is not necessarily to hide that part of it. It's because no intelligence is collected in a vacuum. It also involves
Right.
other kind of intelligence methodologies, sources, mechanisms, and
Hmm.
such. And some of that stuff is still really sensitive.
Yeah, it may
And so,
compromise the person who gave that information, not
for
the
example,
yeah.
yeah. So there are legitimate reasons. There are illegitimate reasons for keeping stuff classified,
Yeah.
but there are also legitimate reasons for keeping stuff classified as well. And so I try and distinguish appropriately here when I'm involved in any of this stuff. So
Makes sense. So
yeah.
on that note, notable viewings or notable things maybe that you were even tangentially involved in.
Mhm. Well, and of course, a lot of this stuff I don't even remember. Some of it
Fair enough. Yeah.
might still be sensitive, um, and a lot of it wouldn't mean anything to people. But
Mm.
I'll talk about some anyway. So we had a whole selection of Soviet research and development targets that we were tasked on, and there were some of it was down in the weed stuff, like some kind of factory that produced certain kind of widget
Mm.
that went into, maybe it was a component of a ballistic missile. Very people generally would not even really be interested, who weren't right immersed in
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
assess threats and stuff. But some of it was, of course, much more interesting. We did so. This happened before I was there. They remote viewed a Chinese nuclear weapons test,
Wow.
and and that uh, let's see who was involved in it. I think it was Swan. Anyway, the remote viewing was successful. The nuclear test was not,
Mm.
but the remote viewing was successful in that it described that people there were disappointed in the outcome, that it wasn't fully up, but there was still a lot of celebration going on because what needed to work did work.
Mm.
So what happened? It didn't go critical. In other words, the nuclear weapon didn't go critical, but the ignition device and the initiation process and stuff apparently was, because it produced a kind of a chemical explosion as opposed to a nuclear explosion or something
Mm.
like that.
Okay.
It was Lopnur. If people want to try and research Lopnur, Lopnur in the archives, they may find the report for this. I'm not sure,
Mm.
but see, and that's what remote viewing is kind of good at, is because we had no intelligence means to actually observe or detect what happened with this test. Uh, but the remote viewing successfully actually accessed what needed to be accessed and reported it accurately.
And
Um,
and was there ever any confirmation on that?
well, yeah, I can't tell you details on that,
Oh,
but I'm
sure,
sure there
sure.
was. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known that it was successful.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but oftentimes remote viewing worked as what we call a tip-off mechanism, where it tells you there's something you need to pay attention to, or something you need to go back and look at that's already happened, because there might be something there that you missed,
Hmm.
and that happened on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, some of oh, go
and
ahead.
so this brings. Go ahead.
No, no. I
Okay.
was gonna shift into something else. So please continue.
Okay, this brings me full circle around to Robert Gates and the people who say that remote viewing never amounted to anything. His specific statement has never influenced any policy decisions or anything. Remote viewing never contributed to that, which is false, actually. Now, whether he realized it was false or not, I don't know. I mean, I had a lot of respect for Robert Gates other than his opposition to remote viewing. So, anyway, no. Oh, Gates. Yeah. So, but Gates said, well, remote viewing no remote viewing ever influenced policy. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Well, I'll tell you one case where it absolutely did. And that was the MX spacing plan. And most people today probably don't know what that means. So MX is what became the Peacekeeper missile. It was one of those multi-warhead ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that we were going to use it as a deterrent to similar missiles that the Russians were fielding. But the problem is we didn't want to build a whole bunch of them, so we built a certain number of them. The idea was that we'd do this shell game where you'd have a whole bunch of these possible firing positions
Yeah.
all throughout the Great Basin, and either they'd truck missiles in a closed container around from shelter to shelter, or it was underground rail line, kind of whatever. Anyway, the idea is to shuttle these missiles around on a random basis so that the Russians would not be able to predict where the missile was in each of the complexes, which means if you have 100 missiles and you have 100 shelter complexes with 12 possibilities, that essentially multiplies by many times the number of targets that they would have to hit with their missiles in order to make sure they did not get shot back at. Right? What you have to think about, though, is essentially what we're doing is we're holding. The idea was that was a missile sink, right?
Yeah.
They would fire missiles and they would be absorbed in the Great Basin instead of going to other targets around the country.
Yeah. Yeah, this is talked about, I believe, in Phenomena, and it's like this humongous, like I think it's like, is it millions of square miles, like section of desert where you
Yeah.
have where there, as you're saying, it is this place where all of these missiles are concealed and then shuffled around, like
Yeah.
in this I mean, I can't even imagine the amount of the undertaking that must have been to build.
Yeah, it was engineering. I won't say nightmare, is engineeringly feasible, but it still was a massive undertaking. And of course, the people in Utah and Nevada, and I'm a native of Nevada. Well, not, I wasn't born there, but I grew up there. And now I'm transplanted Utah. I did not like that plan even back then.
Yeah.
It was, in a way, well, we could get into nuclear weapons strategic planning. I won't get into that either. But because Utah and Nevada had a very small population, they didn't have much political push to get that, fight back against it. Anyway, bottom line was the Air Force was going to go ahead with it, and of course, the Carter administration was behind it. But they tried a number of things to make sure that it was a foolproof system. And in fact, they did all kinds of interesting, like glue little cameras to the back of cockroaches and turn them loose to see if they'd migrate to where the heat signatures were in the tunnels and stuff. They tried all kinds of things.
And they did, right? Like, didn't they kind of get attracted to it?
I don't know how successful that was. I don't even know about the remote viewing part of it. And someone said, well, we ought to try remote viewing. And so the Stanford Research Institute, the SRI folks, this was after Russell had left the program, I think, but it was Hal and Ed May and those folks. They partnered with Charlie Tart. So Dr. Charlie Tart, professor of psychology in the University of California system, was very interested in parapsychology for years. He just died like 2 or 3 months ago, I think.
Oh, really?
Great guy. He's a great guy. He's written some very influential books as well in the field. Anyway, he tried a system. It was a simulation of the MX basing idea with 12 possible locations, and then randomly selected location, the number, REG, I think random number generator, or maybe just a computer with an pseudo REG program in it. It would pick randomly which particular shelter was the correct one, or which particular box was the correct one. And then a remote viewer / psychic was supposed to determine which one it went into. And using a very sophisticated error correction protocol, algorithm, and the input from the remote viewer, they were able to 10 out of 10 times predict the correct place.
Wow. So all this huge undertaking and engineering marvel could not stop remote viewers from predicting where the missiles were.
And of course, we didn't know how well that had worked. I mean, we all knew how well it worked. The paper was provided to the red team, the one supposed to solve this problem. But we didn't know if it had any effect on canceling the program, which Carter canceled the program shortly after that was done.
Wow.
Well, Senator Warner sent, I want to say it was Ed May, sent him a letter, and there's a formal reproduction of that in one of Ed's books, a letter stating explicitly that in his interaction with Carter had admitted the remote viewing was the thing that put the nail in the coffin of the MX missile program.
That's crazy. That's amazing. Yeah, there's, Carter came up recently. I just did a podcast with Richard Dolan, who I'm guessing you know from Contact in the Desert, which I'm going to, by the way, this year.
Oh, good. I'll see you there then.
Yeah, I'm excited. Yeah. I'm really excited. But yeah, he has what he claims to be very, very strong um, anecdotal evidence from a very reliable source, also about Carter being briefed on other things, including ET and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, he's been coming up a lot lately. But anyway, now we're getting real deep into this conversation. I know we have
Yeah,
limited
yeah.
time, but but yeah. So eventually, though, you are tasked with just the opposite of viewing mundane targets, and you're eventually tasked with viewing a lot of anomalous
Mhm.
targets. And I know the unit is in general, like Dames in particular had this huge penchant for trying to view all sorts of anomalous things. And I know there are mixed feelings on this for
Mhm.
obvious reasons. I think it is a very slippery slope and very prone to delusion. But
Mhm.
I've been also dying to ask you about uh, you remote viewing one of these same sites as Pat Price, like we mentioned early on in the conversation.
Oh my, look at the time. I guess we'll have to
Right.
talk about this one. No, no. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, please don't. Please don't. I've been waiting for this. So yeah, Pat Price views these four sites. Um, pretty famously by for anybody who's interested in this lore, at least. One in Alaska at Mount Hayes, one in Africa, one in Spain, and one in Australia. And you, unbeknownst to you, are tasked with remote viewing one of these same sites. And this is sort of in a non-official capacity, if I remember right, or is this part of something?
Well, the stuff we did with Ed Dames was non-official,
Okay.
more or less. This was in a way official.
Okay.
So Skip Atwater was the tasker on this. And I differentiate between the way Skip tasked and the way Ed Dames tasked. Skip was very protocol centric. He was very much concerned with making sure we followed the rules that kept it scientific.
Mhm.
Right. Dames was kind of loosey goosey, so I don't know what to think about a lot of the stuff he had us do. But Skip, if it was Skip that was managing it, I'm quite confident we did it right. And so he had come into possession of the Pat Price notes about the four bases. Putoff had sent them to him probably not too long before this. Putoff was kind of curious to see what we do with it too, I
Yeah,
think is the reason
sure.
that he passed it
I'm
on to
sure.
Skip. And Skip ran Joe on all four of them. And he ran the rest of us just on the Mount Hayes target. And of course, we didn't know at the time. I mean, the viewer's got to be blind to the target. And it's always even better when it's double blind. But so we didn't know what the target was, had no idea, didn't realize it had anything to do with ETs or whatever. Up to that point, we've been working standard um, training targets, which were all geographical locations or similar, right? Something was concrete we had feedback on. But what Skip liked to do, and it's actually a smart thing to do, is get the viewers working. And if you work them on the same kinds of targets over time, they'll start guessing and they'll starting filling in the blanks with stuff they think about
Mhm.
the target because they get to the point where they predict it just based on consistency of taskings. Skip would throw in these ringers every now and again, and it wasn't always UFOs or things like that. But in this case, he wanted. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it's something totally out of the ordinary. But he'd usually pick something that he felt like he had pretty good reason to think there would be some there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and these bases were one of them. So he ran us on this. And I'm not going to discount the fact that he was curious too, right? He was certainly, curious, but he had just some justification from an operational training perspective, and that he was trying to keep us off balance because an off balance viewer, if they're doing it right, are actually a better viewer in the long term. So he ran us on the Mount Hayes target. Mount Hayes is in Alaska, way up in the middle of nowhere, very cold, etc. And we just worked on it. And in my case, so one of the more spectacular ones was Mel Riley's results. Mel actually sketched a cave going back into a mountain, and inside the mountain, this cave, and he had an alien who was playing a keyboard of sorts that he
Wow.
described as a communications device. There was a bunch of other stuff in Mel's session. I don't have it here, so I can't remember all the details. But mine was kind of similar to that, although I didn't necessarily sketch a cave. I'm not even sure. I without going back and looking at it again, I'm not sure I actually got into the insides of it. I mean, I did get into the insides of it, but didn't realize maybe it was enclosed. I can't remember now. What was more important about mine was, first of all, I detected these people. I said, well, they're kind of people. I guess I'd call them people. And I said, and they're bored.
Hmm.
I said, in a way, and I'm paraphrasing myself here, in a way, they felt like military personnel who were assigned to some tedious, distant base away from their families and everything, and they had to do the job, but they didn't much like it there, and that was the feeling I was getting from these folks.
Hmm.
And what was interesting was I drew a sketch of what you would look at today and say that's a tic tac,
Yeah.
based off of the
Yeah.
Nimitz encounter, looked just like a tic tac, and in fact, it was very similar to a sketch that Pat Price has done in 1974.
Wow.
Um, yeah, that's when it was. It was 74 and Price did his stuff. Very similar to a sketch Pat Price had made in 74 of the Mount Hayes target.
Hmm.
Okay.
That's
And so that to me
chilling.
was really,
Yeah.
yeah, it was awesome. But here's the even more interesting thing. I think that I don't remember the feedback we got, but I never saw Pat Price's work.
Hmm.
And I don't think I knew it was Mount Hayes. And I think the bottom line was they told Skip told us, well, this is one of the bases Pat Price reported on, and that's all he told us. Okay. And it wasn't until I want to say around 2006, 2007, the date keeps changing because I don't remember exactly when it was, where Hal let me make copies of all of the Pat Price notes from this. And I, for the first time, got to see what I had remote viewed back in 1984.
Wow.
The Pat Price's version of
Mhm.
that. And I'll tell you, that's pretty fun.
Yeah, that's
That
got to
was,
be
yeah, that was pretty fun.
absolutely mind blowing. Yeah, and I mean, what do you when you have an experience like that, when Pat Price saw something, you saw something, the other remote viewers, I don't know like what percentage of them all agree on or had similar reads on this. How certain are you coming out of it? Again, that no, of course, the greatest thing would be if there were feedback, if you could confirm, but you can't.
Mhm.
I would imagine the next best thing has to kind of be a situation like this, where you have a bunch of remote viewers you trust, and they're coming away with similar results. Is that generally your feeling, or
Yeah, I mean, that's the next best thing, isn't it?
yeah,
To the actual eyes on target, photographic evidence, whatever. That's the next best thing. It isn't absolutely foolproof
sure,
because there is this phenomenon in remote viewing called telepathic overlay,
hmm,
where sometimes one person's mental concepts about a target will bleed over into another person's mental concepts about the target, and you may end up reporting the same thing, and it's all wrong
yeah,
because that the stronger viewer has gotten this mental noise concept and it's bled into everybody else's. Now, the fact that all of us had some experience with not doing that, you kind of learn fairly early on to be more conscientious about it.
right,
Um, Makes me think that there's more legitimacy to it than otherwise. And in that case, kind of the same thing happened to me on another esoteric target, anomalous. I call these anomaly targets.
yeah,
Um, Back after I was in the program, before I retired from the Army, Ingo called me up and said, "Would you be willing to help me with a project?" And it turned out it was remote viewing an anomaly on the dark side of the moon.
yes. I wanted to ask you about this too. Yeah,
Yeah, and there were three working on it. There was Ingo, who apparently wasn't working blind, but oh well, it was Ingo, right?
well, can I
Ingo,
ask how would he not be working blind? How would he
well,
have?
he knew what the target was,
Okay.
and he still remote viewed it, right? Which is generally a no-no, but in his case, I guess we give him some leeway.
But let me
But
but okay, just hold on before we proceed. I just want to focus in on how could he have known
uh,
is my
I
question.
get you.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I say knew what the target is,
Okay.
he knew that there was an anomaly. He knew where it was,
Got it.
and he knew what was known about it, which I don't know what that was. But obviously, the unknowns he didn't know, so he was blind to those. Okay. And until we actually land somebody there, it's still going to be unknown, at least from our normal epistemic kind of approach to
Yeah.
these things. So he did know what the intended target was. He did not know what the unknowns were in that sense. I didn't even know what the intended target was. He just gave me a latitude and longitude. And I get in on this target and I'm saying, well, this is weird. It's like really barren, and there's these kind of mountains around about, and hey, what's this? I can't breathe. Right? I recognized it airless, and at that point, I knew I was on the moon.
Hmm.
And that's of course one of the things you may be blind to start with, but if the data comes in strongly enough, you sort of start to know what you're dealing with, right?
So you
And
have
so,
a vague in the phenomenology involved in these experiences. You have a vague sense of not just data coming in, but being there. I guess.
well, sort of.
Okay.
There's this phenomenon called bilocation in remote viewing,
Yeah.
and I used to misunderstand it. And when Tom McNair uh, finally retired from the army and felt comfortable coming out of the closet on the remote viewing stuff, um, he and I had a discussion about that, and I realized I had misunderstood it. So I'm not going to get into what the misunderstanding was, but bilocation is where you have a consciousness footprint in both worlds, essentially at the target
Yeah.
and also right there in the viewing room with you and your paper and your pen. You're sort of in both places at once consciously. And so you do experience consciously to some degree the target itself, while you are still consciously present in the remote viewing room. And that's, of course, why we call it bilocations, because you're in both places, at least mentally. Um, and so you would expect to have to some degree, some conscious experiences, some experiential experiences, right,
Hmm.
from the target in a setting like that. Now, usually it's not enough different from where you're at in general. Like, for example, there's air to breathe in the viewing room. But the moon, of course, is starkly different in many respects. And so that you would think would be noticeable. And I did notice it. So,
Very.
but anyway, after, after the fact, I was able to, Ingo sent I and the other viewer, who I've never met, uh, copies of his report on this. He had done it for someone else. And what was striking to me was the details that I got, that Ingo got, and that this other guy got as well. All
Mm.
three of us, on a number of different things, sketched and reported very similar things.
Yeah. And those things are very interesting, which we haven't
Yes.
explicitly said yet. So please share. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. All right. So I'll spill the beans. How are we doing on time? We're good. I still have some time. Um, so the overall concept of this is what all of us determined: there was a vast empty cavity inside the crust of what I now know was the moon. That there was a passageway from the surface to it. Now, each of us represented in a little bit different way. Um, Although actually mine was up here and then it went down and then it was underneath. And see, I can do it on camera. So there was an opening up here, there was a kind of a shaft, and then it opened up
Mhm.
underneath. And my experience with this was that it was partly natural, partly artifactual. In other words, it was like there was a natural space that then had been engineered and expanded and reinforced and whatever. Right? Um, and Ingo's sketch was actually similar. It was a shaft going down and then an open space down below. The other guys, I'm blanking right now on what he represented, but it was coherent with what we had done as
Mhm.
well, right? Consistent word I'm looking for, consistent with what we had also done. Now, what one of the very specific things I got, and for me it was one of the more controversial, was this kind of manta ray space vessels, I guess is about what best way to describe it.
Wow.
And I drew a really quite detailed sketch of it. But the interesting thing about this was, for the first time ever, uh, first of all, I detected that this thing was not just a machine, but there was actually a biological consciousness element about it. It's like this was a machine that was conscious
Yeah.
and had biological elements associated with it. Now, we've seen this in science fiction. Recently, the remake of Battlestar Galactica had these ships that were part biological, part physical.
Yeah.
And Stargate, let's see, was it Stargate Atlantis? The Stargate series had something similar,
Okay.
right? Um, but this session was done before either of those things were even created. And so
Yeah.
that part in itself wasn't culturally influenced. What was further of further interest was that as I am remote viewing this object, I'm getting the impression that it's aware of me remote viewing it. And that had never happened before. I had never had the feeling that I was being perceived by anything at the target.
Yeah.
And yet in this case I was. And I got that this thing was really kind of annoyed by that. I was getting a sense of annoyance from this thing, aggravation in the sense that if I could do something about this, I'd stop that guy right now. But it's like it couldn't, and it was on a mission. It couldn't deviate, and even if it could, it didn't really have any mechanism to interfere with me perceiving it. But it felt like kind of like its privacy was intruded upon or
Wow.
whatever, and that I wasn't supposed to be there. And so that was, I mean, there were a number of unique things about that session that I did that I had absolutely no expectation of happening when I first got into it. So, can I say that this is all real? No, I can't say that. No remote viewing is 100%. Well, no remote viewer is ever 100%. Every once in a while, you get a remote viewing session that is, but no remote viewer ever gets it 100% of the time. So maybe it was wrong. I don't know. But the way it correlated with Ingo's and the other guy's stuff was compelling.
Yeah.
And then just the experience of it was compelling as well for me. It still could be wrong, but I'll tell you what, I kind of, it made me think that there may indeed be something to this idea of alien bases on the moon.
Wow.
Which I had kind of discounted up to that point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so of course you're a very epistemically humble person, and you seem like and again, this is why I think you're such a great representative of this conversation. So if you had to put money on black or red here, is it there? Is it not there? Is the Mount Hayes real? Is the thing that you experienced on the dark side of the moon real? Where would your money go?
Well, I would put the majority of it. Which ones is black real?
Well, I
and
meant,
red
are
real?
they real? Are they not real in general? But I
Oh,
see how
okay.
you can take
As
that.
black
Yeah,
and red. Okay.
no. I mean,
I
they could
would
both
put,
be. Yeah,
I got you. I would put the majority of my money on real for
yeah.
both of those cases, but I wouldn't put it all on them. I'd keep some in reserve in case I needed to make a different bet to win back what I lost. Right?
Yeah, fair. Man, there's so much I still would love to talk to you about. And I know we're running out of time here. We haven't talked about consciousness in general. We haven't talked about any of the emerging stuff. So I'm just going to pick some of these emerging revelations now that we're on this topic potentially of NHI or whatever you want to call it. Have you been following these recent revelations from people like Jake Barber and the involvement of so-called psionic assets? And
yeah, as much as I could.
Okay.
And so, I was at Contact in 2023, getting ready to go home, getting in the car to drive back to Utah from Indian Wells. And Judy Chatterton, who is my kind of contact with those folks, comes running out and says, "Did you hear the news?" I said, "No, what?" She said, "A whistleblower's come out and admitted that we have ET craft and ETs in cold storage," or whatever, right? And what? And that was David Grush, right?
Okay.
It happened the Monday that Contact in the Desert ended.
Wow.
Which I don't know if that was symbolic or what, but it was interesting, right?
Yeah.
And so my very first thing was to call Hal Putoff and say, "Hal, is this David Grush guy for real?" And Hal said, "I've been working with him for years. He is absolutely real."
Wow.
And he is absolutely telling the truth. And so I use Hal to vet a lot of these folks, and because I'll tell you what, right now, people suspect Hal is part of the conspiracy to hide all this stuff. He's absolutely not. Now, he does respect classifications. He does respect national security, that kind of thing. So there are things he doesn't talk about, but he has never, ever lied to me. And I've been able to ascertain that on many occasions, because he'll tell me something that might even be kind of outlandish. And then I find out later he was telling me the truth, right? So I trust Hal implicitly. And when he says that somebody is the real deal, I believe him. Okay. Now, I asked him about Jake Barber, and he didn't give me that total endorsement.
Okay.
But we really didn't time. He's kind of like said, "I don't have time to talk about that right now." But it wasn't like with Grush, he came right out and said. Now, he probably hasn't worked with Barber, so that may be one of the reasons he's a little hesitant. But I'm finding it interesting. The psionic stuff. Actually, I'm going to be on a panel at Contact where I'm going to be on a psionics panel
Oh,
discuss
great,
psionics.
great.
Yeah. So I've been doing some homework on that. It seems to me, first of all, it turns out psionics, the term was invented by science fiction writers in
Yeah,
the 50s.
yeah.
Yeah.
Having to do
There
with
was
like
actually,
interfaces between like technology and mind, essentially, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm waiting. So I've been listening to the podcast that involved Barber and his crew.
Hmm.
I've been waiting for number 3 to drop, which is where they're supposed to talk about psionics. But I've also been looking into it behind the scenes. It was a new term to me, and it kind of correlates with a term that we did use in Stargate called psychoenergetics.
Yeah.
And I suspect they may be overlapping terms, if not, isomorphic terms. But I don't know enough about the psionics thing to know yet.
Yeah.
And so, I'm finding out more about it. Obviously, I'm on the panel because they want to know what I think of the crosswalk between psionics and remote viewing. And if it is as claimed to be, I'd say there's probably some points of attachment between the two,
Right.
but they're also not identical
Yeah.
because remote viewing is a passive kind of thing. Psionics is an active kind of a thing. And so they're different in that respect. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I launched into talking. You got something specific here that you'd like me to go towards?
Well, I mean, this leads. I know we're running out of time here, but this leads to the very pregnant question of, from your perspective and from the public's perspective, these largely all psi efforts seem to have stopped in '95 in terms of military interest, intelligence agency interest. I know Skip Atwater has recently said in a podcast that he doesn't think so.
Mhm.
He said that he was aware of like several other programs or something,
Mhm.
which I thought was a fairly big admission for anybody who's interested in this stuff. Um, and these emergences of people like Barber and these psionic assets, and also,
Mhm.
have you heard the story from one of the guys in his team about essentially his grooming as a kid in the gifted and talented program and stuff?
No, I haven't heard
Oh,
that.
this is juicy stuff.
But I'm going to have to tell you this now. I'm
Yes.
sorry, you don't have a need to know.
Right.
Just kidding.
Right.
Just kidding.
Right. Right. But I do
That
need
didn't
to
go
know.
over as
But
well
I
as it
do
would have if
but I do need to know.
so, um, so anytime somebody talks about being groomed in a gifted and talent program, I'm very suspicious of that
Sure.
claim.
Sure.
Very suspicious of it for reasons I won't go into right now. But I don't know about this guy. I'd have to hear a story before I'd reject it. But I have heard a lot of other people saying this that I was in this gifted program and they were recruiting remote viewers. No, guarantee you that didn't happen. They may have now thinking back thought they were.
Mm.
But first of all, the CIA would never recruited kids. It's just too fraught with legal landmines to begin with. And they've already been caught in enough trouble in the past. They could never guarantee they wouldn't get caught in this case. And so they would not do that. Second thing is kids aren't actually the best subjects for these kind of things. There's some discussion that kids are more open to
Yeah.
psychic behavior and stuff. And I don't think that's been proved to begin with, but let's say it's true. Let's say it's true. And one of the reasons is the logical argument. They say, well, it's because kids haven't been indoctrinated in society yet. They haven't been taught that it's not possible. Therefore, it would be possible to them. I had 4 kids and I'm the oldest of 8. And I would not say that's an actual accurate assessment of children. Yeah, they haven't been indoctrinated in society in general, but they also have a very narrow and limited concept of the universe. And their approach to the world is very much physics based, even though they would not know to call it that, because they've only had a limited set of experiences, and all of their experiences had done with cause and effect. Right now, maybe they're still open. There's this term in parapsychology and other disciplines called labile, which means you're subject to influence, more flexible, more influenceable, right? And so I presume their consciousnesses are kind of like that. So maybe in one respect like that. But the further problem with kids is that because they haven't had very much in terms of education or experience in what's possible versus what's impossible. Um, it's very hard to teach them abstract concepts that they may have to understand in order to be successful in an actual applied consciousness project like Stargate or whatever, right? So, leaving aside the thing that they can't legally give consent to have their world changed, uh, which is the big problem if you're a government agency. Parents can sometimes get away with it, but government agency, if it ever gets caught, is in really deep doo doo, right? Um, Besides that, I don't think kids are a good subject for this stuff. They're probably are good subjects for simple tasks. Like there's this Mind Sight, is it called? One
Yeah,
of my
yeah,
well,
mindsight. Yeah.
Hakeem is big into this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Where the kid has a blindfold on and they're able to at least detect colors and stuff like that. That's a simple, easy to understand task by a kid. But if you want the kid to say, well, let's use two different examples: remote view what's in a Russian facility on the other side of the Ural Mountains,
Right, right.
they would have a very difficult time of conceiving of what it is you wanted them to do, and then being able to capture and express the information that they would encounter when they were there.
Yeah.
It would be very hard for them. Go psionics, we're talking projected consciousness, right? Um, in that case, it would also be very hard for the kid to understand what it is you want to do in that context. And whether or not they'd ever even be able to understand it as a young child, I have questions about that. I'm dubious about that.
Definitely.
So anyway, that's my
Yeah.
position
I
on
mean,
this.
it's a fantastical story, and it was particularly fantastical when it was first making the rounds, because he was anonymous, and he was like telling this very detailed and interesting story, but a story that, well, this could just be internet lore. There's no person tied to this. But now
Mhm.
he has gone public, and he's one of the guys on Barber's team. So for me, that at least, okay, this is a person attaching themselves to this story, and he's seems to be working in a capacity where he's
Yeah.
signed off on by someone who seems very impressive. So
At least they're
interesting.
owning it. This person
Yeah.
is owning it. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Where I would like to actually
Yes.
hear or see that. Is there a podcast or some kind of document or
I don't
something?
think
Or
he's done a podcast, but he wrote the whole story, and the story is out there. And I can share that with you for sure. He
please
went
do.
by, yeah,
I'm okay with making preliminary jury is out kind of
yeah,
judgments, but I don't like to make hard judgments until I know what it is that is being claimed, because I've been wrong so many
totally
times in
makes
the past.
sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it seems open-ended even from his story, in terms of like he doesn't even really know like what they were like what the end goal of this was, and there were
Mhm.
many strange things, like details of his story of like being exposed to certain things, and him just not understanding what was going on, and um stuff like that, to me makes it seem a little more credible, because it's not some hero's journey where this guy is like,
Right.
it's there's a lot of open-ended, just intriguing tidbits. But
Hmm.
my friend, I know,
Well, I'm willing to give it a look see. Yeah.
I'll happily share it with you, and I would
Yeah.
love to hear your opinion. But I know you need to go,
Yeah.
um and we've got to let
That physical therapy
yeah.
won't do itself. So
Yeah, yeah, it's so there's something so uh, just, I don't know, like somebody who's so accomplished, and like an actual psychic spy, just like the rest of us, has to work on their back, and has to,
yeah.
it's you're just, like I said at the beginning of this, you're just such an amazing, humble representative, yet extremely accomplished in this whole field.
I'm going to adopt that phrase. Amazingly humble.
Well,
Yes.
you are. You really are. It's like you always try to downplay,
Yeah.
any modicum of talent, which clearly you have in spades. So thank you for your time. I would love to do this again, and I'll
Sure. No,
happily I'll happily share
yeah,
anything you'd like me to share.
sure. No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.